Hi, so it's time to go back into the past with our rose-tinted glasses, and this week have a look at Retribution Paladins, especially now that we're sort of focusing a bit more on specs in the Burning Crusade. So, at the start, I mean, in vanilla, of course, most classes were sort of tied to a particular role. Very difficult to sort of break out of that, especially with the gear and the specs. The talent trees are a complete mess for a lot of cases. For TBC, they had tidied these up considerably. Every spec was, in theory, viable. The gameplay, at least, allowed it to be so. And they were introducing different tier armor sets for the different roles, as well as other armor as well. But right from the start, and this was rather odd, there was no impetus to bring Retributions. Continued to be the red-headed stepchild of WoW, which we have continued to be for most of the history of WoW. The main benefits, you could say to yourself, well, what does Retribution Paladin bring at that time? The main benefit was raid-wide, because what you were able to do was judge Crusader. This was still in the days where you activated a seal. The seal would still only last 30 seconds. You judged, it consumed that seal, placed a debuff on the target. You'd then have to reseal. So you would judge Crusader, and then you'd give yourself Seal of Command as Alliance. Horde had their own seal. There were faction-specific seals. This was madness, because this was also the first time when Horde and Alliance both had Paladins and both had Shamans. We got a seal that I forget what it was called now. It has the same symbol as Seal of Truth now. Seal of Vengeance, I think it may have been, and it was a tanking seal. It did in similar ways to what it does now. It puts a stacking dot on the target, but it's very weak. You wouldn't use it for damage, but it generated a lot of threat, so it's very good for protection paladins who were being embraced. They weren't perfect to start with, but they were definitely usable. But Alliance Paladins, it would be Seal of Command still. Horde Paladins had access to that as well, but they had Seal of Blood, which did a couple of things. For a start, they would twist Seal of Blood and Seal of Command for greater benefit. But also Seal of Blood, when you used it, you took damage. Now this was a benefit because of Spiritual Attunement. Spiritual Attunement was an ability that all Paladins have. They gave it really so that Protection Paladins could do something useful, because Protection Paladins would run out of mana so quickly you'd never be able to generate enough threat. But they, you would take damage. And Spiritual Attunement gave you an amount of mana back equal to, I believe it was 10% of the amount you were healed. Didn't count for overhealing, and it didn't count for healing you did yourself. But it was given as a core ability to all Paladins, not just Protection Paladins. Now, you have to remember back then, you didn't have specializations like you have now. You were just a Paladin, and you picked talents in a different tree. So the only difference between a Protection Paladin and a Retribution Paladin and a Holy Paladin was the talents they had picked. So, unless you were going to make that a talent, and it would be pointless to make it a talent, I suppose, because you would definitely take it. But then that was the case of a lot of talents. But they didn't anyway. It was a core ability. But it was useful to others. It was useful to Horde Retribution Paladins, because taking damage from Seal of Blood meant someone would have to heal them, and they would get mana back from that. And mana was an important resource for Retribution. You would certainly run out of it, much like other DPS classes that used it. It was also useful for Holy. I started off as Holy in TBC, and I very quickly, I would say there was very much a competition on the realm I was on with another guild, who had the guild I had been in, and I left it at the end of vanilla for drama reasons, and then I joined their competitor, and we won the fight to clear Karazhan. And Nightbane was the sticking point for us. And what I suggested we do was, we had 2 Holy Paladins, and I said, look, what we'll do is, I'm not going to heal myself. I will heal you, though, and you heal me. And then we could use each other as mana batteries, because normally as a healer, any healing you needed yourself, you would just do yourself, and there was a fair amount to be done in Nightbane. But any healing that I did to myself wasn't going to give me mana back, because Spiritual Attunement wouldn't work for me. But if the other Paladin healed me, then I would, and the same applies to them. So we were able to blow a lot of expensive heals and still maintain mana by making sure we healed each other. So it had real good use. As long as you could persuade, in a healing group, if you were in a fight where you wanted to blow a lot of expensive heals and mana could be an issue, if you could persuade other healers to heal you instead of managing your own healing, then you could get a lot of mana out of that. So yes, spiritual attunement is really good. But going back to, from my point of view, because I was an Alliance Retribution Paladin, so it was just Seal of Command, and as I say, the Judgment of Crusader, what that did is it increased all damage, it increased the crit rate of all damage done to a boss by 3%. So what it was doing is, if you attacked the target I had Judge Crusader onto it, it would be as if you had 3% extra crit. Now that sounds nice. Why would anyone want to go without that? The reason really, I mean, compare it to Shamus, for example, who provided Wind Fury. Wind Fury gave you an obvious advantage. You didn't have to do any theory craft or anything like that. It was obvious because you could only use it every so often, and it was only party-wide. So when Wind Fury was placed down, you knew it had been placed down because your numbers suddenly got bigger, and everyone likes it when their numbers get bigger. Whereas the buff that we provided was just as good, but it was spread out over the whole fight. And because it was raid-wide as well, you certainly didn't want to stack up on them. And people just didn't notice it, even though they were doing more damage with it. The other thing to note, which was really weird, I mentioned in the vanilla one, if Judgment of... I've got to get these right now. What were they called then? Judgment of Light and Judgment of Wisdom. The ones that you insisted Paladins keep up at all times, because it meant when you attacked the boss you got health back and you got mana back. Not every time, it was a proc thing, but you would get a lot back. And if it dropped off for a second, people would shout blue murder. The only realistic way of maintaining these judgments in TBC was with a Retribution Paladin. Holy Paladins could no longer do that, but a Retribution Paladin could, because Crusader Strike, even though it was nerfed when the expansion went live, what it meant, what it had, as well as doing an attack, it refreshed all judgments on the boss, and that included judgments from other paladins. So you'd get a couple of other paladins to judge. You get one to judge light and one to judge wisdom if you had a couple of holy paladins. Remember, the first raid Karazhan was 10 man. You probably wouldn't have loads of paladins, but when it got to 25 man, you easily could. And your Retribution Paladin could maintain them. It was a little tricky with Crusader Strike being nerfed, because what did have, when they first brought it out, I think it was a 6-second cooldown. Then they nerfed it to 10 seconds. Now, obviously that means it's going to do less damage because you can't use it as often, even though the ability itself with each application does the same amount. But also it did have problems with the judgments, because judgments lasted 20 seconds. So you'd refresh it, so you've got 20 seconds on the clock now. Then you'd use Crusader Strike 10 seconds later. But if it missed, and remember, to start with, you wouldn't have your full 8 or 9% hit we needed, so we never missed. I can't remember. But whatever it was, didn't have it. I didn't have it to begin with, at any rate. So it could miss. It's unlikely to, but it could. Then you're having to make sure you hit it bang on to get that 20 second, and maybe the judgments would fall off, and maybe they wouldn't. So nerfing it to 10 seconds made that more difficult. And as I say, I didn't do this in raids myself. I was healing, but I did do it in dungeons when we did dungeons. Because what we would do in that first tier is you'd go off and do your raids, and then the rest of the sort of raid time, you would split off and all go and do heroic dungeon runs. Because this is when heroic dungeons were introduced, and heroic dungeons were hard. They were hard. Ask anyone who remembers Shadow Labs, or what's the one with Blade Fist at the end? Shattered Halls on heroic mode. They were fearsome. Absolutely fearsome. Like nothing we've seen since. Maybe the challenge modes are the closest thing you ever got to the sort of, challenge modes. Much like that. Where you have to treat it with utmost respect. Except a little bit more, because back then there was still an element of crowd controlling. If you had a big pack with some tough ones in it, you'd want to crowd control what you can, rather than just getting the tank to grab everything. You certainly wouldn't have tanks grabbing multiple packs of the tough packs. There were some packs where you're okay doing that. So, and I used to go Retribution for those because we had, you know, enough healers. You only needed one healer per group and one tank per group. You needed more DPS than the proportionally you would in a raid. And I always did very well on the damage. I mean, people used to say, oh, yeah, really good damage. And it was. There was nothing wrong with the damage Retribution Paladin could do. And from my point of view, the utility was absolutely brilliant. But all of a sudden, people were happy to do without judgment of wisdom and light. And people didn't appreciate the judgment of Crusader, giving them the effectively 3% crit. And there we go. So, Sanctity Aura. I mean, actually, that was another one. What did that give us? That gave us bonus damage and bonus healing done. Remember, auras were still a thing then, but again, party-wide rather than raid-wide. So there was that benefit again, but again, people seemed to be happy to do without that. But as I say, protection paladins at least got it, so it wasn't, you weren't just tied to healing. Except I couldn't stand tanking. I would never wish to be a tank, and I hate it. And I always say there's only one thing worse than being an off tank when I'm asked to do that, and that's being a main tank for me anyway. Can't stand it. Never have, even though it's changed immeasurably. I mean, you know, tanks to begin with, it was very difficult to distinguish a good from a bad tank because there wasn't much to it. It has obviously increased, the skill has increased, and the role is very different now. You know, you can actually respect tanks these days, but it's still not for me. I'm not really keen on doing that at all. So yeah, then what for me personally, so we went through Karazhan, as I say, we got round 1 on that one. Then we started to move into the likes of Gruul's Lair and Magtheridon's Lair, still healing at that time. Then, as we were getting into tier 5, so we cleared Magtheridon's Lair, we were starting in tier 5. Killed Hydros, first boss in Serpentine Cavern, that water elemental. Hydros, was it, or something like that? And then I left the guild for reasons. Basically, what sort of happened, it was a couple of things. Not drama this time, no, there was no drama involved. But basically, I was approached about becoming an officer, and I turned it down. And this has happened since as well, actually, a couple of times. And then I thought to myself, hang on a minute. Because the reason I turned them down was because I'd been an officer before, I'd been an officer in Villa, and it is a lot of extra work. And the least you expect for extra work is that it's going to be useful. No one likes to put a lot of effort in and then it's just pissed on. So my attitude was, well, I liked the guild, I got on with the people, but some of the things, the way things were done, I didn't go with. And I thought to myself, I'm not really... from a raiding point of view, it's okay. As a raider, I'm sort of okay with that. But as an officer, no, because I'd be putting a lot of work into a system I didn't fully believe in. And then the problem is when you're asked that, then you start to realise that I'd never consciously thought about it before. And I thought to myself, yeah, actually. And I was very much sort of perfectionist back then. I didn't like... So if something wasn't quite right, I used to think to myself, well, yeah. And I hadn't been in the guild that long, so it's not like I'd got ties or anything. So I just left and joined another one, which was an utter disaster. The one I joined was and it involved a realm transfer as well. So realm transfers were a thing then. But you were tied. You couldn't realm transfer again for 3 months. So when you went somewhere, you were stuck. Absolutely stuck. And I was stuck with an absolute cack-handed one. But in the guild I joined, I was asked, after a couple of months, to go red, because again I'd done the usual thing. What I used to do as well at the weekends is I would spec, because they didn't have dual spec then. You had your spec, which is holy, and it cost you to respec, much as it does now, except it was much more of a significant amount of gold then. In fact, it was actually straight up more, was it? It capped at about 50 gold, I think. That was still significant. But I used to go ret at the weekends to farm stuff because it would be more efficient farming as ret. I hadn't leveled... I did have a mage out, but I hadn't leveled it up at that point. Or had I? No, I had. I didn't like farming on it. I prefer farming on melee stuff like solo out in the wild. So I went on... And it had better gear anyway, my Paladin. So I just went red. I would get enough gold worth of stuff to not only do all the farming I needed to cover repair bills and get stuff for consumables, so someone could make me flasks and potions, but also enough to also cover the costs of specking ret for the weekend and then respecking holy for the after the weekend when we started raiding again. And then of course it meant at the weekend if anyone wanted to do dungeons or anything like that, well, I would do that as ret because I was ret spec'd. And I was asked in this guild who didn't have a Retribution Paladin, as many didn't, to go by the guild leader to go Retribution. And all I had, the gear I had, was just odds and sods that no one else wanted, so it wasn't ideal, and a bit of Arena Season 2 gear, again, just very basic stuff. So I went round, and it went okay. Some fights went pretty well. Gorefiend was my first one. The first kill I had as Retribution was my first one. Absolutely dreadful when I think back to it now. I was clicking then, as I did for many times afterwards. We didn't have that many abilities. You couldn't do that now. Can't click now. It's just too many stuff. But back then there wasn't that much. I mean, what do you do? You need, obviously you'd be using Crusader Strike. Every time you judge you'd have to reseal, but you could do that in a macro, judge and reseal. Because I wasn't seal twisted like Horde Paladins would have to do. It was seal of command, that was it. You need to obviously judge Crusader, seal of Crusader, at the start of the fight, but then you maintain that with your Crusader Strike. It was unlikely to drop off. It could, but by this, if you didn't have your hit cap, it was unlikely, and if it did, you just sealed that and judged it again. Consecrate you could do a bit of, but single target wasn't always useful because it would, if you were full on mana, you would use it, but it used a lot of mana. Exorcism would only work against demons and undead. I don't think Gorefiend was either. If I think about it, I can't remember. May have been classed as undead. Not sure. And I think we had Holy Wrath, did we? I'm sure that was still core. But by and large, Crusader Strike, seals and judgments most of the time. And Hammer of Wrath once you got down to below 20%, I think it was then. So there wasn't a great deal to it, really, let's be honest. But I also had the job of dispelling. It was like, well, you'd have dispelled as a Holy Paladin, so you're going to dispel now as Retribution. Oh, thanks very much. And I didn't have mouse off for a macro, so I was actually physically targeting the people on the unit frame. So it meant two things. First of all, I was actually still staring at raid frames. Which isn't ideal as DPS. And still individually clicking people when they got the debuff, which was very damaging. You had to dispel it like in a second before it killed them. And dispel and things like that. I keyed the dispel. That was the thing. It was a weird thing. I say I was a clicker. As Holy, I used to do a bit of a mixture. I would generally, for my healing spells, do use keybinds because you needed your mouse free to be clicking on the raid frames, and I use that for movement and stuff like that as well. So it was a bit of a mixture there, but when it came to DPS, I clicked. And it went all right. Did reasonable damage. Certainly nowhere near the top, but again, I did have extra little jobs. And a lot of the things I would just do as a matter of course now. I would have mouse over macro. I use click now, but it's the same thing to do things like dispels. And I would have ranged my... Because that was the other thing. The way you want to set up your UI is a bit different, healing and DPS. And I still at the time had a really small monitor, so I didn't have lots of space on the screen. It wasn't very high res, and didn't have like... I would have had some add-ons, but no UI add-ons really. It was all standard Blizzard UI, I think. I think it was. I probably would have had... Well, we had CT Raid Assist in Vanilla. I'm not sure whether I still use that, or like Aura or Aura 2 or something in TBC, which allowed you to customize like raid or at least drag raid frames to different places. But anyway, so yeah, I haven't done around that guild. But it became clear to me that although the guild leader asked me to do this, the opinion was divided amongst the officer team. Something I found when they actually made me an officer. And I couldn't believe it. It was a complete culture shock. And I thought, what have I let myself into? Because you think to yourself, well, why did I accept? Was it because I agreed with the way they were doing things? No, I didn't. But it was so unstable. We were losing people every week and having to... It was easy to recruit because when you're top of the realm, we were on a shit realm, but we were top of the realm. And so it's actually quite easy to recruit because realm transfers were a much bigger thing then. There was no cross realm or anything like that. So if you wanted to raid, you were stuck on your realm unless you wanted to pay, but then you'd be stuck there for 3 months. So we had no problem getting others in, but it's still not ideal. You want a stable raid team to be able to do good progress. I mean, the progress was decent, don't get me wrong. It was all right. But it could have been better. And I joined it, and I just found this thing. I thought, oh my God, there's so much infighting in this officers team. I thought, this is impossible. So I ended up leaving that. And then joined a guild that was specifically recruiting a Retribution Paladin. So now I was completely full Retribution Paladin. Very nice guild. In fact, I would say it's probably the nicest guild I've ever been in terms of like how people were. It was a guild that I don't think you could... I'm still surprised thinking back you could get away with being a guild like this, because they were totally casual in the sense that there were no attendance requirements. It was simply that if you attended most of the time, you would get in most of the time. And if your attendance was much lower, you can expect not to get in as much. So, you know, whether you were included or not obviously depended on what was needed for the fight, but largely was dependent on how much commitment you were showing. But there was no guilt trips or anything like that. If you couldn't make it one night, you couldn't make it. No problemo. Just try and let people know there was still a sign-up thing. So you'd still sign up for which days you could make it. But if you couldn't make it, it's no big deal. If there was a whole week where you just suddenly weren't going to be able to make it, that's fine. No problem. But obviously you wouldn't get, if you were someone who was only turned up 50% of the time, even the times you could make, you would probably only get in 50% of that time. So you'd be only there for like a quarter of the time, which means your gear would get behind on the rest of it. But there were no guilt trips or anything like that. It was a very nice guild, very nice atmosphere, no drama, zero drama. It's the first guild I've ever been in where there was no drama. We did night outruns at the weekend as well. They were good, nice, and it was absolutely brilliant. But again, I got the slight impression after the first raid that people were not totally convinced. I was the first Retribution Paladin this guild had. But afterwards, I think I won them after the first raid, and it actually went really well. And I did have people congratulate me. So that's what gave me the impression people were not convinced beforehand. But after that, it was absolutely fine. And went with those through the rest of Tier 6. So we killed Illidan. I missed the first kill, unfortunately, because at the time, which is why it was a good guild for me, I taught evening classes. And on the night they killed it, I had an evening class, so I couldn't make it with work. Because I taught maths on an evening. And I'm trying to think. The day before, though, we'd nearly killed it. I was really annoyed because we'd nearly killed it. I'd almost done the first kill, but missed it. It's always annoying when you miss a guild first kill. Yeah, because that's always nice when you're in there for the first kill with your guild. That's the nicest feeling in raiding, I think, and I still think that now when everyone's doing it. But yeah, but I did eventually leave that. I left that one. But the reason for that was not because I didn't like them or didn't enjoy raiding with them. I absolutely did. And actually, the progress they were making was decent still. I mean, they were still killing things before next. I mean, they killed Illidan like just in time for Sunwell and stuff like that. So they were on top of stuff. And as I say, to have it with such a relaxed attitude was brilliant. And we did start off Sunwell. Oh, the trash in Sunwell gives you nightmares, doesn't it? Oh, God. Especially, it seemed to get less nasty as you went in. The trash leading up to the first boss was probably the worst trash in the old place. Even when I remember clearing it sometime later, it was always the trash leading up to the first boss. You thought, oh, God. Oh, no. I wish someone would knock on the door so I could go AFK. Not that I ever would go and answer the door when I'm raiding. But yeah, oh God. But what happened was that like a real life friend had come back to the game and he was on the original realm, and in those days there was no real idea to keeping tabs in game wasn't really doable, and as I say, no cross realm stuff like that. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to go back to that realm, and the guild I'd left at the start of TBC were recruiting for Retribution Paladin again, so I went and joined them. And that was okay. Except as we got into Sunwell, I was bouncing around all over the place. Not between Retribution and Holy this time, but between Retribution and Protection. Because they didn't have a dedicated Protection Paladin. They had, what were their tanks? They had a Warrior tank. I think they had 2 Warrior tanks, which wouldn't have been unusual then. Because you had limited choices. You'd have a Guardian. No, you wouldn't have a Guardian. It'd just be a Feral Druid then. Because Druids didn't have Guardian spec, but they had Bear. But it was in the same spec. Cat and DPS and tanking tree was the same thing. Or melee DPS, I should say, for Druids. They would be most useful on tanking the flame, one of the flames of Azinoth on the Illidan fight. They saw much more limited use. I would say of the tanks, which you had Paladins, Warriors, and Druids. Is that it? That's it, isn't it, TBC? Those 3 classes could tank. And Druids saw much less service, I would say. They would be much more likely to be Bear on some fights and Cat on most fights, I would say. My experience, anyway. But yeah, this particular guild, we didn't. So it was 2 Warriors. So when a Protection Paladin was required, as it was on a number of fights in Sunwell, or at least preferred, I used to go Protection. And again, there was no dual spec. So what would happen is, once we were clearing it, once we'd gone through, is I'd be Retribution for the first boss. I'd be Retribution for the second boss, Brutalis. Then Felmis, the third boss, I would be Protection. So I would go off to Stormwind, respec to Protection, have to muck about with all my buttons to change that, get me Protection abilities on there. Again, there wasn't a load of them. And then, because I was used to sort of kite the ads on that one, throwing down Consecrates, and we did have Avenger's Shield, didn't we? Holy Roll, whatever else would do it. And grab all the ads up in a big ball and kite those around. Then the next fight was Eredar Twins. I used to go back to Retribution for that. Wasn't actually bad because the trash between Felmis and Eredar Twins was a bit dull, really. So yeah, I missed a lot of that. So I would go back and do that. It cost about 200 gold each time. Not for me. I mean, the guild paid for it, of course. Then after Eredar Twins, it'd be Muru. So I would go back to being Protection Paladin. It's actually the one video I can actually I've still got. I did start recording as well for fights like first kills, which meant also progress, but I'd delete those. Didn't have much hard drive space. But I've only got so many of my TBC ones left. It was TBC when I started doing this, so I don't have any vanilla ones. And yeah, so the only one I've got of me tanking, I think, is this Muru one. And there it is. All I'm doing is stood at a wall. Can't even see anything. I kept trying to swing my camera around for the kill video so we could at least see a few other people. But it was very difficult from there. It was a relatively low ceiling for the size of the room. And I would just stand there. And one of the other tanks would bring me a void thing, which when it died would spawn a lot of mini void spawns. And you would consecrate and holy shield and just maintain those sort of things. And that'd be about it. That's all you could do. That's all you needed to do. Just hold them together. And then warlocks would throw seeds of destruction at them and kill them and stuff like that. AoE them down. And then the next lot would be brought to me. Until right at the end of the fight, when I would try and do damage I could, but essentially just try and stay out of everyone's way. Because you had this big ball thing that would, if it targeted you, chase around you. You didn't want it hitting you whilst other people were in the area. It'd fuck them over. So I was mostly just trying to not bugger anyone else up, because it was a huge DPS race once he turned into Entropius, and I didn't want to screw anyone else over, but you know, just do what I could at that time. And then on Kil'jaeden, we did start off with me being Protection Paladin, but ended up being Retribution. So once we were clearing the place, it was like Retribution, first 2 bosses, then respec to Protection, then immediately respec to Retribution, then to Protection, then to Retribution again. So yeah, that's 4 respecs. So 200 gold. As well as frequent requests to mages. Can you make me a portal to Stormwind, please? Then to Warlocks. Can you summon me back, please? Actually, could you summon into instances then? Must have been able to. I certainly wasn't going to be making it back myself, was I? I think there was a time when you couldn't summon into an instance. Maybe that had been sorted out by TBC. I must have. I don't think everyone ran out the instance to summon me back. That'd be silly. I don't remember it taking that long. Must have been able to summon back into the instance. And that's pretty much how TBC went for me. And, you know, in terms of... The other thing about Retribution was that you basically needed everything as well, apart from Spirit. In terms of, like, stats, it was... One thing that was very difficult for gearing for Retribution Paladins was you needed everything. Like, everyone else didn't need everything. Like, you needed attack power and spell damage bonus. Like, Caster needed spell damage bonus. Physical attack dealers needed attack power. You needed both. Because some of your attacks were physical, like Crusader Strike and your melees. And that did a lot of damage. That was a large chunk of your damage. But then you also had other things, like Exorcism, if it was a demon or undead fight. And there were a number of demon and undead bosses, particularly demon bosses. You know, and Holy Wrath and Consecrate and Judgments and all these things were holy damage. So they didn't benefit from attack power, they benefited from spell damage bonus. Then, in terms of your primary stats, you wanted Strength because that buffed your attack power. But you also wanted Intellect because that buffed your spell crit. And you also wanted Agility because that buffed your physical crit. And remember, you still needed crit then. You still had Vengeance. Vengeance had been nerfed in terms of the amount of damage it did. It went from 5% per stack up to 3 stacks to, I think it was 3%. I think certain things were nerfed over the course of TBC as well, or changed. Crusader Strike did actually get buffed slightly because I said at the start, it went from 6 seconds in the pre-TBC patch to 10 seconds. I think it ended up at 8 seconds cooldown. They buffed it a bit later in the expansion, quite a long way into it. And so you needed all these stats: strength, agility, intellect. You know, even though it wasn't your most important, you wouldn't say no to it. And then attack power and spell damage bonus. It was horrendous. And then towards the end of TBC, and this was very much towards the end, when I think we were in Sunwell. I don't think we'd finished Sunwell at this point. They then did change it. They sort of changed it so you would get spell damage bonus from attack power. So you didn't have to worry about spell damage. Even though they kept, I remember on the tier 6, some of the gem bonuses were for spell damage bonus. They kept that the same. They didn't bother redoing those. But so they did start to sort it out by then. And I think then into Wrath, they had a much better idea about it, although you were still using agility into then. But anyway, that is a story for when we go into Wrath, which will be next week. Next week it will be Wrath and Cataclysm together, because I took a large chunk of absence of leave from the game in those 2 expansions. So for me personally, they're not as big. But there's my story about Retribution and me playing Retribution, particularly, or Paladins in general, because I started off as Holy, ended up as Ret, and did Protection here and there all the way through as well. And in TBC. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, I'll see you later.